Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to share this episode about Tasmania with you listeners out there. I talked to David Cox, the state manager for Hawthorn Football Club. His role involves the coordination of bringing 4 home games of football to Tasmania and the tourism opportunities that it presents. It's my first time interviewing an Australian guest, which was great because it was done at a normal time of the day. But more than that, it's really exciting to share how diverse Australia is, and I'm so proud to be showcasing the different states and what they have to offer. Tasmania, in my view, is a little island on the southwest of Australia that, despite being so small, punches so far above its weight in tourism offerings, boasting some of the most fresh food and wines, rich culture and history, and breathtaking hiking and trekking that Australia has to offer. Coming to you here from Melbourne, looking out onto a city street, and then talking to David, who overlooks 5 acres of rolling green hills, I was just thinking, I have to get down to Tasmania ASAP for some fresh air and wide open space. It's a great episode today, and I really hope you all enjoy David's passion for Tasmania that is just so prevalent in the way he talks about his beautiful state. Here's the episode. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, one thing I like to ask all my guests is, what do you see, hear, and smell when you step out of your front door in Tasmania?
Well, I'm actually singularly lucky because I'm based in Launceston, but I'm about 15 minutes out of Launceston. If I look out my window now, we've got a beautiful, we're on 5 acres, so lovely lawn overlooking an old English hedgerow and rolling hills down to the Tamar River. So there's a vineyard next door, which in autumn looks beautiful because of the leaves, but it's completely fresh and clean. We went out bike riding this morning, and it was just, if I was a religious man, I'd say it was almost godly, which I'm not. However, it was just, we are so blessed with it being a very fresh, clean and green environment that it just smacks you in the face. It's beautiful.
Fresh, clean and green plus winery. Is there anything more you could want?
Right.
So for those who don't know, can you just tell us a little bit about where Tasmania is and what the best way is to get there?
Yeah. So Tasmania is the island state off the southeast coast of Australia. It's the very bottom of Australia. So it's about a 45-minute flight from Melbourne. It's separated from the mainland by Bass Strait. So the 2 ways to get into Tasmania to fly in, and there are 2 key airports. Hobart down south in Tasmania is the capital. So, and then Launceston in the north is a regional city. Both of them have direct flights to other cities around the country. And then Devonport's a small regional airport which connects to Melbourne. And the Spirit of Tasmania, which is a ship with 2 ships called the Spirits, and they go back and forth from Melbourne. Cargo, backpackers often go on those too. So it's well connected. There's no international flights at the moment, although there are movements afoot to connect with New Zealand direct from Hobart, and that obviously is reliant on runway length and kind of the weight capacity of the runway. So it's beautiful because it's remote from the rest of the country. So it has a topography it's very unique. So the last time it was connected to the mainland was 10,000 years ago. So wow. You can imagine that there are animals and cultures that migrated south and then were cut off for the last 10,000 years. So it's a very unique location.
I have to admit, I am very excited for this podcast. I have been to Tasmania a few times, and I really feel like it's a fascinating place and has really only come into the tourism spotlight in the past 10, 15 years or so. And I want to make sure that we cover everything Tasmania has to offer, and I know that is a plethora of things. But I wanted to start off, with what you said with the nature. Tasmania is full of nature, hiking trails, and I know that your motto is come down for some air. So can you give us a little bit of an overview of what the hiking, national parks and the walking trails are like?
I think the first way to start that part of the conversation is to explain that 20% of Tasmania is World Heritage listed wilderness. That's a big chunk. The fifth of the entire landmass in Tasmania has been set aside for World Heritage, and there are endless tracts of forest and wilderness that aren't World Heritage listed but still exist. So, that, of course, the Western Wilderness is really probably the most primal, and primal, I guess, is the word I use because it is very ancient rainforest. It's some of the least touched land on the planet, and in fact, the Northwest was identified by the United Nations as having the cleanest air and water on the planet. Um, so it's an island blessed by this abundance of alpine mountainous regions, beautiful coastal hinterland. There's obviously been a lot of clearing of land for agriculture and farming, and that lends itself also to some beautiful topography as well. But Cradle Mountain is probably the jewel in the crown of Tasmania in terms of the location best known for a wilderness experience. Cradle Mountain got its name because these two kind of peaks have a dip in the middle, like a baby's cradle, if you like, and there's a beautiful lake called Dove Lake that sits at the base of kind of that area. And so one of the best walks in Tasmania is the Dove Lake 3-hour circuit that you go around. But walking, to your point, is one of the key tourism opportunities that we present to the world. And in fact, Tourism Australia has a program called the Great Walks of Australia, and I think 4 of them are in Tasmania out of the 8 or 9 or so. So it's big. So the most well-known hike or walk would be the overland track, which goes around the kind of Cradle Mountain area and through that beautiful alpine region. It's pretty harsh. You would never go there in winter in terms of the 6-day walk because it's completely brutal. And even in summer, you can have snow and flurries, but it's extraordinary. It's actually at least half of it is a wooden boardwalk that obviously protects the tundra and the alpine heath. So that's the best known. Probably the second best known is a relatively recent creation called the Three Capes track, which is the southeast of Tasmania, diagonally, opposite in terms of its location, down near the kind of Port Arthur. And it's this extraordinary track over 3 days that walks on these 3 capes, as the name would suggest. And one of the reasons why it's so extraordinary is because at times you're very close to death. I mean, if you took 3 feet to your left, you fall off Jurassic cliffs. I mean, it's extraordinary and completely beautiful. And it has, I think you can do it under your own steam, but if you go with a company as well, there are these beautiful state-of-the-art huts that you can sleep in at night. So you have this amazing walk during the day and you have a very comfortable night's rest, and some companies will cook you food. So it's amazing. But coastal walks, also the Bay of Fires walk is probably the third big one that's very well known. And the Bay of Fires on Tasmania's northeast coast has beaches that are so extraordinary that Lonely Planet identified one of the beaches as being one of the top 10 in the world.
Wow.
We've got a beach house there.
Oh,
and it's
lucky
lovely.
you.
Yeah. But, to paint a picture, it's a lot of these beaches on the Bay of Fires have got these red lichen-covered rocks. Lichen is the moss that covers rocks, and red and orange. And so there's this brilliant, almost fluorescent, beautiful, burnt orange look of these rocks that ease down into, on calm days, this totally turquoise water that looks like you're in the Bahamas, and this white sand that's so white that in bright summer days, you can't open your eyes on the beach. It's too bright. very cold water. It's quite deceptive. So you think
There's
you can have
there had to be a downside.
rough. I
It was
know.
all sounding way too perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it's idyllic. So, there's three very different types of hiking and walking in wilderness areas, but they're equally beautiful.
I think one of the great things about the walks as well, and this is a tip to everyone that's listening, is that a lot of them you do need to book, and a lot of them are run through companies. And it's really great that they do make it book because it makes sure that these walks are not crowded. And as you said, there are companies that have lodges, and I know that people can have like spas and like have spas for their feet at the end of the day as well. And so you can sort of choose what level of luxury you'd like, but they are really great. And I do recommend booking as well if people do want to try those walks out.
Well, the other key point is the interpretation that you get when you're on these walks. So, I remember years ago going to the Northern Territory and going to Kakadu and taking part in a whole bunch of ranger and Indigenous guided experiences. And I had friends of mine that did it under their own steam, and they weren't that wowed by it. And I said, "You've missed it all. You've missed the story. The storytelling about the location is brought to life through guides that help you understand and interpret." There's a new walk on the East Coast called the Wookalina Walk. The same area as the Bay of Fires, but it's Indigenous. It's probably Tasmania's, I don't want to say first and only because I'll get that wrong, but it definitely is the most highly regarded now Indigenous tour run by an Aboriginal corporation. It helps unlock the secrets and the storytelling around Aboriginal people that lived on the coast, and it's extraordinary. And they've had created these architecturally designed, I hate to use the word humpy, that's, I think the word that was used for kind of the huts that Aboriginals built when they owned and when the land was unfettered access by them. So they've got these great architecturally designed huts that you walk and then you stay in them. So that's also amazing. But of course, having them interpret the land and their history is the critical part of that experience.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think Australia, and a lot of people don't know this, we really shy away from our Indigenous history and colonialism, and it's not often something that is really present when people do come and visit, and you really have to find these experiences specifically if you do want to experience Indigenous heritage. And on top of that as well, Tasmania has I think 4 out of the 9 Australian UNESCO World Heritage Sites in a lot of our convict history as well. So I know that Tasmania was a state where many convicts from Britain came down to settle. And so they do have a lot of UNESCO World Heritage Sites like the Cascades Female Factory, Woolmer's Estates, the Coal Mine Historic Estates. Could you tell us a little bit more about them and where they're located?
Yeah, it's actually a fascinating story because to your point, Tasmania was settled as a penal colony. So it was for the worst people to come down to. And then Port Arthur itself was for those that reoffended whilst they were in Hobart, got sent to Port Arthur. So it was the worst of the worst of the worst. And that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the cultural importance around the anthropological history of Tasmania in terms of the European arrivals. The Aboriginal stories are quite a separate one, so I won't touch that because that's not part of this particular conversation. In terms of those World Heritage Sites, you've got Maria Island off the east coast of Tasmania, which is had a convict settlement. You're right about Port Arthur and the coal mining sites, because one of the things they realised early on was that it was far too expensive to import coal to help sustain the new colony. So they found a coal site on the Tasman Peninsula, and they coal mined that. And they used to send the children of convicts down there on ropes to seek out and dig. It was terrible. You can imagine how it would be. And Woolmer's and Brickington Estates is fascinating because up north, where I am, the northern part of the state, they tried to recreate a class system like England. So southern Tasmania was settled as a penal colony for convicts and for criminals, quote unquote, and northern Tasmania was settled as landed gentry. So it was so people, aristocracy occasionally, not aristocracy, nobility, people with wealth would send down their children to take charge of vast estates in northern Tasmania, for crops, wheat, barley, hops, obviously wool. So Woolmers was one of those estates. And Brickenden Farm, which is opposite Woolmers, is another World Heritage Site. That's a working farm. It still works, still owned by the same family that started it, 250 whatever years ago. And essentially, what's so fascinating about those Woolmers and Brickenden is that they were the start. The entire history of Australia's agricultural success started here in northern Tasmania. And then spread out across the country. It all started here. So it's fascinating. And of course, it was done on the back of convict labour.
Yeah, a lot of rich history there.
Yeah.
So a big reason that Tasmania has had a large rise in visitors, and it would be amiss for me to not talk about these things, is largely due to Mona, so the Museum of Old and New Art, and as well Dark Mofo, which is a festival smack bang in the middle of winter. And I feel like these descriptions, obviously just knowing them is not in any way a accurate description of what they're really like. These are really out there, interesting, really exciting museums and festivals. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, you're so right about, 10 years ago, Tasmania was popular, but it was nowhere near right in the way that it is now. And Mona gave us a 10-year head start. So they kicked us 10 years into the future in terms of where we could be. So probably the kind of success we've got now without Mona would be another 10 years into the future. So what it did was, Mona was firmly established Tasmania as a cultural destination and worthy of one of the top modern art museums in the world. So Bilbao in Spain, MoMA in New York, and the Tate in London, and then Hobart are kind of the top four. And can you imagine Hobart? And not just Hobart, a suburb of Hobart. The kooky guy that started it's essentially a shrine to all his weird interests. And so I won't go into detail about some of the things you can see there, but there are some there's quite an obsession with death. And some of the historic interpretations and culture and themes around death and sex and life. It's fascinating, and it's built, I guess, within a cliff in the suburbs of Hobart. So part of the appeal of Mona is actually the architectural appeal of going down into this museum carved out of the belly of this kind of peninsula. It's fascinating. And the collection is extraordinary and changes often. But Mona was kind of the kickstart then for other things that this guy, David Walsh, wanted to do, which is constantly to provoke, make people feel uncomfortable, challenge people. As most art does, he does it to the extreme, totally dials that level of challenge and discomfort up. That's what he wants to do. And to the point where if an exhibit becomes too popular, he'll just take it out. Because, so he started Mona Foma, which is a music and art festival in January in Hobart. Performance, installation, art, music, you name it. And then he started back in 2012, I think, Dark Mofo. What was interesting about Dark Mofo is it's built around the winter solstice. So it's very primal. It's very paganistic because it culminates, in this celebration of kind of fire and death and life. And it's for years, Tourism Tasmania, and I worked with Tourism Tasmania for many years, as you know, we really struggled with how to position Tasmania as a viable winter destination because Tasmania is cold and dreary in winter. It's just the way it is. So how could we flip that and reposition it to present Tasmania as somewhere that's a desirable place to go in winter? And so we used to talk about things like, go into the cabins in the hills, with some snow, and it was very immature, kind of draws some kind of the European heritage of mulled wine and that kind of open fire. Really unsophisticated stuff, but we didn't. There's nothing to get past that. There's no other offering. Dark Mofo comes on board and has the independence from government and the to be able to do what they want to do. And so they basically say it's dark and brooding and dangerous. And all of a sudden, this new cohort of people, the young 20, 30 somethings that like this kind of dark, brooding, dangerous, edgy nature, looked up and said, okay, what's happening down in Tasmania in winter? And the first year, I think they had 10,000 people attend the event. And then last year it was like, I don't know, 80,000 people. It's just this extraordinary phenomenon. And he will do whatever he wants with that arts and music festival. And what's refreshing is I remember reading an article in the Sydney Morning Herald from a culture features editor that had come down to Dark Mofo. And he said, this would never happen in Sydney. Because in Sydney, you'd have bollards, you can't go there, you can't do this, that's too dangerous. But obviously, they've got to be risk averse to make sure people are safe. But beyond that, it's not sanitised at all. It's fascinating. And to the point where in 2014, we got a call. We didn't get a call. I shouldn't say. I work for Tourism Tas. Dark Mofo got a call from Coldplay, the band. He said, we're in Tokyo, we're finishing up, we've got like 10 days between our next set in somewhere else on a world tour. We've heard you're amazing. We want to come down and do a free concert. Like, when does Coldplay ring you and say, we want to...
No, never. Coldplay's never called me before.
And actually, it didn't come to pass because the airport runway couldn't sustain the weight of the aircraft or the equipment to come in. They couldn't, so it didn't happen. But the point being, that was the credibility that had been created around Dark Mofo.
Yeah, absolutely. And
a catalyst for winter travel.
Yeah, even better. It's smack bang in the middle of the low season. As you said, it's, I do want to preface that Tasmania is very cold during the low season. You really want to rug up, but there is so much available and so many activities that are happening, and it is really exciting. And those, both Mona and Dark Mofo, are two things that you truly have to experience to really understand what they're like. You can try and explain it all you want, but they are both out of this world experiences that you just have to try.
You have to see it to be part of it. And the cold thing, I mean, plenty of places around the world, everyone's not everywhere. It's a lot of cold places in winter. It is what it is. I think our problem in the past was kind of resisting that instead of embracing it. So part of the Tasmanian brand is to embrace those things that might be difficult to talk about. The Aboriginal history is one of them. It's a really difficult conversation to have because it's not a pretty one. But we will embrace that because it's part of the Tasmanian story. Saying it's cold and dark and brooding in winter, that's okay. Actually adds an element of excitement about your visitation here. So, honesty is integral to our brand.
Absolutely. And for those that don't know, when is Tasmania's low season?
It's essentially from Easter through to about November, really. So as soon as the Easter holidays are over, it's traditionally it's been a bit of a cliff. So our work when I was at Tourism Tas was to shorten the impact of low season. So try and extend the shoulder seasons as much as we could. So bring the shoulder season back to maybe September, so that our true low season is really maybe June, July, August, those hardcore months. And part of the success of that was to try and ensure that we had airlines still servicing Tasmania significantly over that period. So every year we would lose 20% of seats into Tasmania over winter because an airline has a finite number of aircraft. They take them out of the Tasmanian market and say, well, demand is low for Tasmania in winter, so we'll reallocate those aircraft to, say, Queensland and northern Tasmania because demand is higher because people want to go north where it's warm, which is actually makes perfect sense. So we knew that that was never going to end, but what we could do is minimise the impact. So one of my strategies and goals at Tourism Tas was to try and retain a significant number of seats and not just lose them. So we went from losing 20% of seats into Tasmania to losing 10% of seats, which is a significant gain. So
Yeah, that's great.
over the course of winter, that might have meant, 10,000 extra bed nights, so there are ways to measure it.
So a big draw as well for people to coming to Tasmania is the food and wine. I mean, as you said, you live next door to a winery. And living in Australia, I know that any product that I buy that sort of has the seal that it's made in Tasmania or from Tasmania triggers in my mind that it is going to be fresh, organic, delicious, and it has a brilliant reputation. And so what are the best things to try in Tasmania for food? And other than the one that you live next door to, what are the best wineries for people to visit?
Well, the one next door to us actually is just a vineyard that produces for other labels, so it doesn't have a cellar door. It's fine. But you're so right. Tasmania punches well above its weight in terms of food. It's low volume, but very high quality. So it's not inexpensive, and I'm totally okay with that. You certainly wouldn't come to Tasmania if you wanted to scrimp on your food. You pay for quality. Cheese is probably, for me, the number one thing here in Tasmania. The cheese is extraordinary. So the Bruny Island Cheese Company, Ashgrove Cheese, up in Bruny Island's down south. They've got an extraordinary cheese production business down there. Ashgrove up here in the north. There's a bunch of others, Wicked Cheese, etc. Cheese is phenomenal. But things like sauces and jams, there's a guy recently, the last 10 years, who decided he'd go into wasabi manufacturing, if you can believe that. And so now one of the best wasabis on the planet comes out of northern Tasmania near Devonport. But
who would have thought?
I know. The state is littered with beautiful markets. And that's what I think is so lovely, because these markets are delivered by the community and they're frequented by the community. So there's this beautiful, cyclical, self-sustaining market or food culture. The food economy is what we call it, which is prolific. So the harvest market up here in Launceston, I think, is one of the best harvest market in the country 3 or 4 times in its 10-year history. It's lovely seeing the people. They're people that they're friends, or they're the parents of kids your own kids go to school with, and here they are now selling on the weekend their extraordinary produce, breads, beautiful artisan breads. And the vineyards are amazing. So close to me here is one of the best ones called Joseph Cromie. Joseph Cromie, I think, a couple of times has won like the world's best Riesling or something at the London Wine Awards. I mean, they're very, and there's a number of wineries across. So in northern Tasmania, we're known as as kind of probably the cool climate winery capital of the country. And so the production, but you've got people like Clover Hill up here in the north. So the Tamar Valley around Launceston is probably the number one wine producing area in Tasmania. Sparkling wine is prolific here and extraordinary and holds its own with French champagne. And then the Kor River Valley down near Hobart with the other key wine growing area. But to be honest, across the entire island, there are wineries popping up everywhere. So you've got fantastic, Freycinet Vineyard. You've got, on the East Coast, they're everywhere. And most of them have got cellar doors and extraordinary landscapes for you to look out on, and have incredible food. So it's this marriage of beautiful wine, sparkling wine and cool climate wines, great food, that's been produced through, harvesting from the immediate surrounding area, and a beautiful geography that means you just sit there and you're also eating with your eyes at the same time. Man, I love it here.
Oh, yeah. Your passion is showing. I mean, it is a beautiful place. I can attest to that. It is just absolutely wonderful. And because it is so small, the most popular way to get around is hiring a car and doing a road trip. So, if people were to come visit, what sort of time range would you recommend, and sort of route that you would recommend as well if people were hiring a car?
That's a great question. And one of the challenges we had in the past was people were confused by Tasmania because there was so much to see and they didn't quite know how to get around to do it. And if you look at it just kind of as a map, you think, oh, things pretty close together. Like it's from Launceston to Cradle Mountains, probably only 150 kilometres, but it's like a 2.5 hour drive. Because the roads here are often windy, which is part of the delight, because around every corner is a delight and a surprise of a landscape or a roadside, jam stall or a beautiful little village. But what people, our average length of stay for people who are touring with a car is 10 days. Having said that, people might fly into Launceston and spend 4 or 5 days in this area and then come back for a second trip. And so to that point, I think part of Tassie's statistics would show in the last couple of years that 70% of people that came to Tasmania came again the following year. So it's got
That is a huge amount.
massive. So it's a very high repeat visitation destination. And that's because people come down, they realise there's far more to see and do than they thought, and they needed more time to do it. So they had to come back and do kind of a second visit. The danger for people is to say, I'm going to do Hobart, hate that term, by the way. I'll fly into Launceston, I'll do Hobart and, West Coast, whatever, and then within 4 days. And all you'll see really is the car. Really, outside the car window. It's far too, you can't do the island in that kind of time. It's just, you better to do it in chunks and say, I'm actually going to go to Dark Mofo, for example, and I'm going to spend a week maybe or 4 days. And I'm going to go to the festival, and I might go to 2 other locations outside of Hobart only. And I'll come back and I'll go to northern Tasmania or the west or the east at another visitation, another trip. But touring our bread and butter.
Yeah. And so, as we mentioned earlier in the introduction, you work for the Hawthorn Football Club. And for those who don't know what that is an AFL team, so Australian Football League here in Australia. And I would give it a example of an equivalent sport, but there really isn't one other than Gaelic football. And not many people really know what that is either. AFL, I highly recommend you going on YouTube and looking up top 10 best marks. It is a very exciting sport.
Yeah, well, American football would be, for an American audience, that. And so the Super Bowl for American football is our grand final.
Yeah, and we love it so much here in Melbourne that we actually get a public holiday for it on the Friday before the grand final, just to sort of prep, make sure you've got the sausages for the barbecue. So,
the parade.
Yeah, so it exactly, it's very close to my heart. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your role there and what that means for tourism in Tasmania as well.
Yeah, it's funny, when I left Tourism Tasmania after having, 20 years in the tourism industry, people are like, what on earth are you doing going to a football club? It seemed totally left field, but it won't feel left field when I explain why. So the Tasmanian government sponsors Hawthorn Football Club. So Hawthorn Football Club is based in Melbourne, and every team plays a series of home games that they own. So over the course of 28 games or so across a season, 11 games are the responsibility of the club to put on. 4 of those home games are played in Tasmania. So Hawthorn plays 7 of their home games in Melbourne and 4 of them in Tasmania. And the reason they did that was because they identified many years ago that Hawthorn probably, in terms of the Hawthorn membership and its fan following, probably had the closest football demographic in terms of someone that might want to come to Tasmania, because Hawthorn traditionally is a blue ribbon club. It's in a Melbourne that's an AB demographic, high disposable income, traditionally speaking, for Hawthorn, rich suburb. So we wanted those people to come to Tasmania. So the government created a relationship with Hawthorn to use the club's channels and its relationship with Melburnians and others as a way of amplifying the brand, talking about the things you could see and do. And so it became kind of a tourism partnership. And of course, the 4 games a year down in Tasmania, people would come down and visit. So in any given year, the value of that sponsorship was worth about $28 million to Tasmania in cash.
Wow.
People would come down to Tasmania, they'd stay 3 or 4 days. They'd go to the game, they'd hire a car, they'd stay in hotels, they'd go to the local grocery store, they'd buy souvenirs, they'd go to the markets. So we tracked every bit of spend. So the tourism outcome, when you think about it, makes perfect sense. So I joined the club because I had this strong background in tourism marketing, brand development, and I guess, customer profiling and segmentation. And I was able to bring to life this partnership with Hawthorn in a way that made sense for Tasmanians. So it wasn't just about coming down to a game, it was coming down and experiencing all that Tasmania has to offer. So it's been a really fantastic partnership. I've been with the club now 6 years, and we're the first club in the history of the Australian Tourism Awards to enter the Tourism Awards. And we won, in our first year of entering, a gold tourism award in Tasmania as the #1 festival and event in the state. And we analysed everything you could possibly imagine of the business. We analysed and we did a 12,000 word submission. So it was a thesis, essentially.
Yep.
And we won a Gold Tourism Award, which is a great accolade and acknowledgement that what we're doing is delivering great outcomes for the visitor economy in Tasmania.
Yeah, and the great thing about the footy games as well is that they're in low season. They're throughout winter, and it's easy just to buy a ticket online and
that's right.
make sure you grab a sausage roll and a beer, and that's a fantastic evening.
To your point, the partnership is funded through Events Tasmania because we're seen as events, and Events Tasmania will always look to support those events that are regional and off season.
Well, that's exactly what we're about too.
Yeah, there you go. So obviously, Dark Moto isn't regional because it's in Hobart, but it's definitely off season. And the ripple effect of having, tens of thousands of people come down in winter, obviously spreads out of Hobart. But Launceston will be seen as being regional Tasmania. 4 games over winter in a regional location is absolutely what this government is about.
David, you have painted an absolutely beautiful, fresh, clean, just angelic view of Tasmania, and thank you so much for joining us today. It has been really wonderful, and I am so desperate to get down there as soon as your borders open. It is pretty much the first place on my list to go.
Yeah, well, I can say we feel completely blessed to have been here during this year. So, and I clearly love Tasmania, so I can talk about it till the cows come home.
Yeah, I knew I'd have to cut you off. We could just keep on going and going. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Right, take care.
Another big thank you to David for joining us on the podcast today. It's so wonderful to talk to someone so passionate about where they live. And to be fair, it doesn't seem hard when you're living in Tasmania. Thank you for listening today. And if you have any suggestions of destinations that you'd like to know more about, any feedback or questions for us, make sure to message us on our social channels @LowSeasonTraveller. We'd love to hear from you. Stay safe and healthy, and more now than ever, travel is better without the crowds.